too systematic. But I wanted to make sure that everyone, in a way, knows what a philosopher is thinking when they think about consciousness, what problems they are thinking of. Hey, hello. Yes, how are you? Oh, very nice to meet you. Yes, that's right. Is that right? Oh, very nice to meet you. So you're now at University of Sydney? No, your PhD is Sydney.
Monash.
Monash. Oh wow, that's nice. Yeah. Oh, very nice.
He was my honor student.
Yeah, okay. Yes, PhD.
I've seen your PhD design.
Oh, is that on the shelf? You know there are two content pages. When I was there,
so long and so they're two content pages.
Yeah, there was a concise and a long content page. I don't know why that people were doing it that way. But anyway, so then you went to Sydney.
I just followed the page.
Yeah. I didn't make it up.
I'm not doing that.
So what, you're doing consciousness-related topics?
Yes. Philosophy of mind, maybe.
Yeah, right.
Maybe the hardcore.
Okay, perfect for here, right? Good. So there you probably, because my thesis was on this stuff, but it's 2001. So if you're doing stuff recently, so I may use you to help explain. The philosophers in the audience are my co-tutors. Yeah.
Wow.
So maybe two. I think I submitted the end of the other round, but I thought it was a long time ago. So nice. So you're now, I see you're now assistant professor on a PhD. So you're okay.
Yeah.
All right. Congratulations.
I don't think we're doing any philosophy.
No, he does religion these days, basically, right? Yeah.
So these days, if you want to do a philosophy of mind.
So you were there when Jakob Hobby was also there?
Yes. But my honor thesis is also philosophy of belief.
Okay.
So he's coming on the path.
Definitely. Oh well. Thanks very much for introducing yourself.
Maybe we will wait for one or 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yes. That's a good question. Which one? I think probably not holding something might be better, so shall I use this one?
Okay. I have some instructions or something. Today, this tutorial is already we are doing live stream of this tutorial session. So the point is, so John wished to make this tutorial interactive. So he will ask question, or you can ask question during this tutorial. So the point is, use your microphone. Now we are doing live streaming, so the audience can hear the question. It's also important. Now today the mic is already on, so you don't worry about how to use it. Just use it. Okay. Now please start. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Masatoshi. Thanks very much for inviting me. And so it's true that I was imagining this as a kind of interactive tutorial, but that's also, I was imagining a small room. Roughly the same number of people, but a smaller room. And I didn't think clearly about the live streaming aspect of it. Oh, okay. Maybe I didn't turn it on. Right, I didn't turn it on. Shall I use the other one? Okay. Oh wait, what's up? Oh. Is that too loud? No? Okay. It's up to you. Oh, is it? Okay, that sounds a bit better. All right, I'll just hold this then. So, I say thanks very much for inviting me, Masatoshi. It's great to be able to help, actually, that's my goal today. It's not particularly to put forward my own theories of consciousness, but to try to make sure that by the end of it, particularly the scientists among you who have maybe not done much philosophy before, have some better understanding of how philosophers are approaching the problems or what kind of problems they're approaching, so that when you talk to a philosopher, you somewhat know a bit more about what they're thinking. That's my goal at the end. The problem partly is that I have no idea how much you already know about philosophy and philosophical problems and approaches to consciousness. So that's partly why I wanted to have make it interactive. So perhaps at some points I might just stop and let you collect your thoughts and think about anything that you just didn't get from what I said, and I can go over it again in a different way. Because the important thing is your understanding. Okay, so I guess I thought I would start from the basic what is philosophy question, and everything I say from now for any philosophers in the room is going to be very controversial and probably wrong from their perspective. The question of what is philosophy, there are a lot of people have a lot of ideas about what philosophy is or should be, and none of them are basically generally accepted. But there are some common things that people will often agree with. So I'll give you some of those, just as a way into how philosophers are often thinking about what they're doing. And so here, and in this way, I'm talking about philosophers in the most general sense, not people doing philosophy of consciousness particularly. I'll start generally. So here's one of them. This is going to strike you as very vague and unhelpful, but I'll read it anyway because a lot of philosophers will say that this accords with how they're imagining what they're doing. So Wilfrid Sellers in 1962 said this: that the aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. And that's not going to be very helpful to you, but it's somehow for a lot of philosophers it helps them understand what they're doing. Another thing, though, that Sellers is famous for putting forward as the aim of philosophy is the reconciliation of what he called the scientific image with the manifest image. And what he meant by that is that, so through science we build up a picture, a model, if you like, of how the world is. But we already have a picture of how the world is that we get from day-to-day experience and interacting with others and talking about things. We have in our own minds, and perceiving for that matter, we have a sense which is just manifest to us in daily life and what the world is like. Then we have this picture that we get from science about what the world is like. And part of the job of philosophy, or the main job of philosophy, according to Sellers, is to make these two somehow fit together into one package, if you like. So to reconcile the scientific image with the manifest image is one task of philosophy that a lot of philosophers, I think, would agree with. But here's another one. This is one I kind of like as well. And it's Wittgenstein had this idea, is often quoted, that a philosophical problem has the form, I don't know my way about. And that as a consequence of that, his analogy of what a philosopher is doing is to show the way out of the fly bottle. And it's a very enigmatic thing to say as well, but what he meant, and what a lot of philosophers thought around that time particularly, is that philosophical problems arise because in some way we've gotten ourselves confused. Whether it's from a confusion in the language, a confusion in some wrong turn we make in our thinking that we just keep making, and it just leads us to the wrong direction. Somehow or other, philosophical problems are confusions. We're just kind of lost in our own thoughts somehow. So the task of a philosopher then is to just try to untangle things so that you can see it a little bit more clearly. And once you've done that, then the idea is you no longer have a philosophical problem anymore. It's either obvious what the solution is, or perhaps in some way it's going to be just an easy problem, by which, in Chalmers' sense, meaning an empirical problem that you can just figure out by doing the experiments or whatever. So that's one way that I kind of like. So philosophical problems are just ways that we've confused ourselves. And a bit earlier than that, you get John Stuart Mill. This is a quote I like, and it was at the beginning of my PhD thesis, actually. And Mill says that language is as it were, the atmosphere of philosophical investigation, which must be made transparent before anything can be seen through it to the true figure and position. The idea is that, so within philosophy you often find that we're talking about words and concepts. And the idea is that it's these words and concepts in a way which are tricking us, and we need to get clear about what we're talking about, and that can be often getting clear about how we're talking about something. And once we've figured that out, then we can go on and solve the problem. But we often find that at certain points we stop and start talking about the language. And that's another way, or a related way of talking about philosophy. This is a lot earlier than that, 1874, whereas Wittgenstein is more or less 80 years after this. But anyway, that hopefully gives you some sense of how philosophers are thinking about philosophy. It's definitely not the only way of thinking about philosophy, and as I say, probably for each philosopher in the room, in this room, there'll be a very different way of thinking about what philosophy is. But that gives you some sense. So this is the more difficult part of the tutorial. I thought I would give you a sense of how this was done in a kind of technical way 100 years ago or so, we had the beginnings of what's often called the linguistic turn in philosophy. And it starts with Bertrand Russell, or at least it starts with, actually before that, with Gottlob Frege. But Russell wrote a paper that did change the way that people think about how to solve, how to approach a philosophical problem in terms of the language that's used in terms of the problem being the language. And I'll just go through this example, and I'm not sure that it will get the point across, but let me just give the example. So there was a problem in philosophy. The problem was of terms that refer to things like, in this case, the King of France, the present King of France. And Russell had a problem, or there was a problem with this sentence: the present King of France is bald. The problem is that there is no king in France. France doesn't have a king. So what does this refer to? The phrase. And there was a big problem about this, because if you say it refers to, well, nothing, it's kind of an empty set, right? But if that's what the word means, then everything that refers to, everything which refers to something that doesn't exist means the same thing. So it can't be that the meaning is this empty set. It's got to mean something, it's got to pick out something. So people were coming up with all kinds of kind of metaphysical ideas about what this could be, that the present King of France, what the word refers to, is it including, for example, that the present King of France doesn't actually exist, but he exists as a kind of possibility. So the possible King of France or something, or the King of France has some kind of reality in order for us to talk about him, but doesn't actually exist. People were getting really in knots trying to solve this problem. And Russell's solution was kind of ingenious. It's in a paper called On Denoting. And he said, well, maybe what's going on here is that the present King of France is actually a shortened version of a longer expression. And when we say the present King of France is bald, we're actually saying a couple of things in here. And one of them is that there is a King of France, and the other is that that person is bald. Actually, I didn't mean to go so fast. Let me go back one further step. So the other problem with this sentence, the present King of France is bald, is that it doesn't clearly have a truth value. This was important particularly to people in a logical frame of mind, for whom every sentence like this has got to be true or false. There aren't any in-betweens. So this was also a problem. The present King of France, is it true or false? Well, it's obviously not true, but it's not false either, because there just isn't such a person. So this was another problem they were trying to solve. So Russell's solution was that, well, this sentence, the present King of France is bald, is it's kind of a shortened way of saying something much longer. And if you kind of analyze what's being said in this sentence, you get something like this. Something like this. So there is currently a king in France, and that person is bald. And now we have a sentence that's just clearly false. There isn't, because there isn't a king in France. We're just saying something false. And there's no problem of referring to a non-existent entity. You're just postulating something. Right? So Russell's Russell was very, very proud of this solution, and this became one of the classics in analytic philosophy. And it started a trend, and the trend was to try to solve problems in this kind of way by thinking of the problem as not inherent in the topic itself in a sense, but not caused by some complexity in the world, but rather the problem is caused by a complexity, our not understanding the complexity of our own, what we're saying, of our own language. So this is, in a sense, the beginning of analytic philosophy, and so people went on to do this kind of thing meaning to try to figure out a solution to a problem in terms of trying to understand what we're saying and untangle that. The style of analysis changed. In Russell's time, it was very much transforming a sentence into logical form and predicate calculus and that kind of thing, but that's not the only way to do it. Still, you will find people trying to figure out first what is maybe the problem here is not with the phenomenon, maybe it's with the way that we're talking about the phenomenon, the way that we're thinking about it. We're confusing ourselves because we usually have to use language even to think about things, right? So anyway, I don't know how clear that is, but I wanted to give you a sense of how philosophy has been done and kind of the change that the linguistic term brought about into thinking of things in a much more linguistic way. Okay, so that's a sense of what is philosophy. It's a very simplistic and one-sided sense, but I hope that gives you some idea for those of you who this is new to. So methodology. Philosophers always have a problem with methodology on grant forms, where you'll be asked, what's the methodology for a study? As a philosopher, my inclination is to say something like, well, I'm going to think a lot, and that's what I'm going to do. That's how I'm going to solve this problem. And that's in a way what we're taught to say. The philosophers don't tend to be taught that there is a methodology of philosophy. There are just problems, and however you can solve the problem, solve it. And nevertheless, you can pick out some common, let's say, strategies that philosophers will use. And I don't think these are things that are done only in philosophy, but there are things that, in some ways, as a group, characterize how philosophers go about things. Yes, and you will see some philosophers defending the idea of a methodology which is unique to philosophy, which is particular to philosophy. I'm not sure that's true, but certainly there, as a group, you can find as a kind of cluster of things that people do to solve problems. You will find something like this. Now let me just go through them. So at the top, you've got, of course, logic and reasoning, including everything from Aristotle's original studies into syllogism. Syllogism as in if A then B, A therefore B. This kind of simple syllogism is something that Aristotle wrote about, and there are lots of patterns like that that were described, but then much more recently you have the logic, both formal and informal logic, which are of course part of the methodology of not just philosophy, but of course logic is now its own field in a sense, and it's debatable whether it's, in some ways, whether it's philosophy anymore. So the other one is fallacy spotting. So a fallacy is it's a kind of reasoning which is intuitive but also wrong. So there are lots of fallacies actually. Not all of them are philosophical fallacies, but so here's the famous fallacy of let's say it's called affirming the consequent. So the syllogism I just gave you, if A then B, A therefore B. So it's kind of natural for people to make this following reasoning. If A then B, B therefore A. It's a kind of natural way for people to reason, but it's known to be, it's obviously not valid, right? So that's a famous fallacy, but there are other fallacies that are not just, so here's I guess you would call it a probabilistic fallacy. It's not particularly a philosophical one. Do you know that, you must know the gambler's fallacy, which is if I'm doing roulette and I roll, red 10 times, if you ask me what's the probability that the next one will be red, I'm going to say, well, it can't be even. It's got to be more probable that the next one's going to be black. that's obviously fallacy. It's not particularly a philosopher's fallacy, but it's an intuitive way that people naturally think that we also know on reflection that it's the wrong way to think. So fallacy spotting is one thing that philosophers have done, which is why, oh, we might have to go do this. You'll see philosophy departments, oh, this is not showing. Philosophy departments, I'm going to just try to show you this. It might not work. So, yeah, if you can see, this is just the Department of Philosophy College in Texas, and they'll have to help their students lists of fallacies. This is in a way what philosophy departments teach their students. At one point, they'll teach them a whole bunch of fallacies to look out for. So fallacies is another kind of method that is common. If you like fallacy spotting. So clarification of language is another thing that philosophers are known to do a lot. And by that I mean disambiguation. And as you, in studying consciousness, you probably come across various places where people disambiguate the word consciousness into 2, 3, 4, 5 different kinds of consciousness, different things that consciousness could mean. The state consciousness and creature consciousness, and so on, phenomenal consciousness and so on. So making clear all the different possible things you could mean when you say a word. And that's important partly because it helps. There is a fallacy known as the fallacy of equivocation, where you have an argument where in the premise you use the word in one way, in the conclusion you use the word another way, that is to say with another meaning. That kind of reasoning doesn't work, so it's very important to spot when that's happening, and so getting clear on which disambiguation of a word you're using is important. So philosophers are often known for making these distinctions. Sometimes it feels like it gets too much. There are too many distinctions being drawn, but of course it's an important thing to be aware of. The other thing is conceptual analysis. There are some philosophers who have argued that conceptual analysis is the method of philosophy. And they'll give you examples such as the study of knowledge. So the study of what knowledge is often thought to be the study of the concept knowledge, or the clarifying what knowledge is what we mean by knowledge in some way. And the famous analysis that's often given as a kind of success case is the idea that what knowledge is a justified true belief. So we say that you know something if you believe it and it's true and you're justified in believing it. And these three things are necessary and sufficient. Often, at least nowadays, it's a lot more complicated, but this is taken as one of the kind of success cases of philosophy doing its kind of core task of finding out, of discovering in some way what knowledge is by analyzing the concept of knowledge. And the final one I'll talk about as thought experiments as a method, or sometimes people talk about this as the method of possible cases, or something like that. So you get, and very often all of these will go together. So, for example, in opposition to the idea that the belief that knowledge is justified true belief, somebody will give you at some point probably what's known as the Gettier case. And Gettier case is an example of somebody who's justified in believing something and it's true, but they don't know it. So an example would be that we would normally say, you're looking at a clock over there, and you'll be justified in believing that it's close to 10 o'clock. But it could be that, let's say, that clock is actually broken. You just noticed it now, and happens to be stopped at 10 o'clock. But that is the right time. In that case, you would have a true belief that would be justified, but you wouldn't know that it's 10 o'clock because it's just lucky that it happened to look over at the clock on that time that it's showing the true time, even though it's broken. So thought experiments are one way that we, one thing that philosophers do a lot. You'll be probably aware of Mary the neuroscientist thought experiment. Can I just get us a sense of who does? Probably everybody, but maybe not. Is there anyone who hasn't doesn't know the Mary the neuroscientist thought experiment? Can I get a sense? Oh, okay. Well, I'll definitely go through it then in more detail later on. I'll start at the beginning later on. Okay, so you'll be introduced to this thought experiment later on. So, as I was saying, so it's not necessarily that all these methods are purely philosophical methods. All of them you will use in some way in other fields. But as a kind of a group, in some way they characterize, I think, what philosophers do. Okay, so that's philosophical methodology. So before I get on to the consciousness part of this, and I realized, I was wondering whether I'd have enough time, but I've only got this far, and it's already half an hour. So I wanted to give you just my quick take on this. The way that I think about philosophy is something like the avoidance of what I'll just call a thought trap. So this can be a fallacy, but I'll just call it a thought trap is a train of thought or reasoning that we ought to avoid, but for some reason we find intuitive and we keep falling into it. And philosophy is the task of finding and making clear these thought traps. It's kind of a negative conception, but it can involve positive theories of why we do this. You know, why this kind of reasoning is so attractive to us. Otherwise, it's kind of a negative conception. So in that sense, a question like what is consciousness isn't a philosophical question, but it can become a philosophical question if we suspect that the answers to it are falling prey to some kind of thought trap, I'll just call it. There are some kind of, whether it's a kind of ambiguity that we're going one way at some point and another way on the ambiguity, which is making us come to a mixed conclusion on something, or whether it's an outright fallacy that we're making, or whatever. Things become a philosophical question when we suspect that somehow our thinking on this problem is somehow confused, and we have to fix our thinking about it. At least, okay, I'm not going to subject you to any more of my takes on things, but I thought I would at least give that much. Now, of course, that sort of thing is not particularly the sole responsibility of an academic philosopher or a philosopher. Basically, it's everyone's responsibility not to fall into thought traps. But it's just that's what philosophers do as their main job. And that's what distinguishes philosophers. But philosophy is whenever you're doing this. So in that sense, you're all doing philosophy at some point of your day when you're trying to think things through, just think it through more clearly. Okay, so now I thought I would kind of apply these, or show you how these are, or have been applied to problems in philosophy of mind, and particularly of consciousness. So let me go through these. I actually couldn't think of one for logic or reasoning, a logical approach to the problem of consciousness or mind. There probably is one, and I just don't know of it. Does anyone else know a logical a logical approach to the problem of consciousness. I forgot to mention at the beginning that if you're another philosopher in this audience, I automatically think of you as my fellow tutor in this tutorial. Yeah, anyway, I couldn't think of my name. Okay, so I'll call this a fallacy. Maybe not everybody calls it a fallacy, but it's this is a brilliant one. RYLE'S kind of dismantling of an argument by Descartes. I'll give you the argument first. I don't know if you've come across it, but it's a really strong argument. So here it is. Anything that's physical has dimensions. It's extended is actually what Descartes would say. Anything that's physical has some dimensions. You know, it has a width. That's what defines being physical in a certain sense. Being physical means having dimensions. This is Descartes, so we're talking about 400 years ago. And the mind doesn't have dimensions. There's no real answer if I ask you how wide is your mind? Where's the center of it? It just doesn't have dimensions in that sense. And therefore, the mind isn't a physical object. That's one of Descartes' key arguments, that the mind can't be physical. And it's a good argument. And it really convinced people, or helped to convince people for hundreds of years. It's very simple. Anything, physical objects, all have some dimensions. The mind doesn't have dimensions, isn't extended. Therefore, the mind isn't a physical object. It's a very simple argument. And so, I don't know if anyone knows the Gilbert Ryle's solution to this. So this is Ryle's famous solution. He accused is probably the wrong term, but he wrote that Descartes is guilty of what he called a category mistake. And category mistake is, well, here's Gilbert Ryle's 1950 answer to Descartes' argument. Basically, Ryle says he agrees as far as that the mind can't be a physical object. The mind can't be a physical thing because physical things have dimensions and the mind doesn't have dimensions. So Ryle agrees up until this point. But then he says, well, there are two ways of not being a physical thing. One way is to be a non-physical thing, but the other way is not to be a thing at all. And Ryle's argument was that. So the mind is not a thing, and this was what he calls Descartes' category mistake. He put it into the wrong mind, into the wrong ontological category. Minds are not things, they are something else. And of course, as you may know, Ryle is famous for his behavioristic theory of the mind. The mind is what we do, how things function. It's a kind of event, if you like. It's not a thing, not an object, and therefore not a physical object. So this was Ryle's category mistake argument, a kind of against dualism. So I thought I'd give another example of a fallacy. Again, I'm not totally sure everyone would call this a fallacy, but yeah, the idea is this, and this comes up in especially discussions about consciousness. Here's the intuitive idea. It's that, well, if I'm aware of something, then there's got to be something that I'm aware of, which easily translates to, you know, if I'm aware of something, then there exists, there is something I'm aware of. This is a really intuitive thing to think, because it feels like it's just a slight grammatical change in the sentence, right? It doesn't feel like you're really changing the first and the last things being said at all. So, but there is a fallacy here that's been pointed out earliest, I suppose, by Brentano. And the idea is, before I point out the fallacy, this comes about in discussions of consciousness because people very often go from, I'm aware of a red sensation, and therefore there is a red sensation that I'm aware of. And so it's very intuitive, right? It feels like, how could this fail to be true? So, I haven't put the solution to the problem. This originally Brentano in the 1800s, when he's talking about intentionality, being aware of something, then the idea was that you can be aware of something and there be nothing that you're aware of. And that's often the case when you're dreaming, you're hallucinating, you're thinking just thinking of a golden mountain. Doesn't mean that there's a golden mountain. Intentionality, being aware of, has that feature. You can be aware of something that doesn't exist. So in that case, it's just not true that if I'm aware of something, then there is something that I'm aware of. Those two things mean something different. And that's something to be aware of, and that people like, like Dennett will often emphasize this in his arguments about consciousness. We can be aware of, just because we're aware of a phenomenon, a quality, let's say, doesn't mean that there is a quality, that there is something that has those features that we're aware of. Okay, so disambiguation, I'm not even going to go into this really, except because you've probably read many places where they disambiguate the word consciousness, and it's useful and necessary, even if it seems sort of pedantic sometimes. The idea of the basic distinction between the idea of creature consciousness, the idea of a whole animal being conscious, as opposed to the idea of some state within that animal being conscious, you know, belief being conscious, or as opposed to unconscious, or you know, a desire being conscious or unconscious. So that kind of distinction is a really useful distinction, which I guess philosophers have made. But if there are some scientists who made this distinction, then they were in their philosophical mode when they made it, so it doesn't matter for my purposes. Okay, so conceptual analysis is this has come up in as a kind of controversial method in philosophy in some ways, but here's where it first appeared really strongly, I guess, in the idea of pain being a brain state. And before I get to the pain case, I'll go through what's regarded in some quarters at least as a much more obvious case of water. So you want to ask, well, what is water? The first thing that you need to do is to ask yourself, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by water? And you'll need a clear answer to that before you can actually go and do your studies about what water is. But that'll then give you the answer. So if I ask you what is water, well, it's the stuff, you know, in this cup, rains comes out of rains water comes out of the tap, it's in the seas, it's wet, and so on. If that's the answer you give, when someone just asks you what is water, meaning in a way, what do you mean by water? Firstly, you give an answer to that, and then a person can then go, well, so you mean like the stuff in this cup? Then they'll You say yes, they'll say, okay, let's go and study what that is. And they'll discover that what's in that cup is just a bunch of H2O molecules. And then you'll know that water is H2O molecules. That's the idea of beginning by some kind of conceptual analysis and connecting that to empirical research. That's this kind of way of proceeding is sometimes known as the Canberra plan. That in all cases, this is how we figure out what there is, and it's nature. So in the case of sensation of red, this was done by J.J.C. Smart in a paper in 1959 called Sensations and Brain Processes. And he applied this kind of answer to what is a sensation of red. And it's a bit unlike water in the sense that you can't give it to somebody to study because it seems sort of, it has this kind of private element. But Jack Smart thought, well, there is a sense in which we do mean something when, and you can explain what you mean when someone asks you, what's a sensation of red? You know, you can tell them, well, it's the state that you're in when someone shoves a tomato before your eyes, or you're seeing blood, or you're seeing maybe that red folder, over there. Here, the state you're in, the state when we're in, when we look at things that we agree are red. That's what it is. That's what a red sensation is. And then the idea was this gives you then something to hold on to that you can then study. So then all we have to do is figure out, well, what state are people in when they look at red things? Once we figure that out, then we figured out what is to be a red sensation. So this is known as the topic neutral approach, which resulted in the identity theory of mind-brain. So Jack Smart basically wanted to say that for mental predicates, this is how we can, we don't have to, we can discover that there are brain processes in this kind of way. At the same time, people were, this is just after Ryle published his category mistake argument. So in that sense, these are something of a piece. Right, but it's not the end of the story, because there are now particularly a lot of people who will deny that red sensation means that. So that's not what we mean by a red sensation. That it means something a little bit different, maybe something more like just, this, looking at a red object and it's this feeling, or something like this. So, and if that's true, it might be more difficult to do this method. But that's the idea, and you'll see people still arguing for this kind of way. In fact, I argued for this in my PhD thesis, but that's a whole other story. Right, thought experiments. Okay, so for those of you who don't know the Mary the Scientist thought experiment, this is where I'll let you in on on what it is. So maybe I'll stop there, because Mary the neuroscientist is going to take a little while. It's an important thought experiment to keep in mind, but it's going to take a little while to do so. Maybe I'll ask if anyone has any questions. I know it's difficult to ask them in this environment, but if you have any, feel free. Clarifications, I mean. Okay, that's fine. So in that case, let me go on. So, but I do want to make sure that I don't just end up by confusing everybody. So if there are things that you want me just to go over, or then please at some point feel free to go up to that mic and just ask me to say something in more detail. Okay, so Mary the neuroscientist. So here's a thought experiment that is fantastically influential in philosophy of mind, and I suppose in some way, well, in philosophy of mind at least. So the idea is this, and the conclusions of the argument is going to be that Mary the that phenomenal consciousness, or consciousness, let's say, is not physical. That's going to be the conclusion. So it has to be a fairly powerful thought experiment to get you to believe that, right? So here goes. So we imagine that there is a neuroscientist. We call her Mary. She was called Mary. And this neuroscientist has come to know everything that there is to know about how the brain works and how it functions. And I guess we also imagine she knows everything about integrated information theory. She knows everything there is to know about the functioning of the brain and how to describe it. And she knows how color perception works. But she's never actually seen in color, turns out. So she's just spent her whole life in a black and white room, not able to see color. So just as an aside, you're probably going to say this point, but if she's never seen color, probably she wouldn't be able to suddenly see color, right? But we ignore that. She happens never to have seen color, but she has the ability to see color. And she just never seen red, and she's just never seen anything colored. But she knows how color vision works to the molecule. Okay, so one day she goes out of her black and white environment and she suddenly sees a red post box. And she has a red experience for the first time ever. And we're asked, so does she learn anything? At that moment that she sees a red thing for the first time, does she learn anything? And the answer we're encouraged to give, or that Frank Jackson, whose argument that this is, thought he thought it's obvious, and many people think it's obvious, that she does. She learns what a red experience is like, what it's like to have a red experience. She didn't know that before, and now she knows it. Therefore, she learned something. There's some fact about the universe that she didn't know, and now she knows. Namely, what it's actually like to have a red experience. So, if there's some fact that she now knows that she didn't know before, but she knew all of the physical facts, down to the molecule. She knew all that. So that means that what it's like to have a red experience is a different fact from all those physical facts. So that means all the physical facts aren't enough to describe, aren't enough to, let's say, amount to an experience of red. So there's more to a red experience than all the physical facts you could describe. Therefore, conscious experiences in general, if we generalize, are non-physical, have some kind of non-physical nature. That's the conclusion. So that's the Mary the neuroscientist argument, otherwise known as the knowledge argument, because it crucially involves the idea that when Mary sees the red thing for the first time, she gains new knowledge. And what could that knowledge be if not so about some non-physical fact? So that's the Mary the neuroscientist, and it's been a very powerful argument. I'm not going to weigh in on it. I just wanted to describe it because this is published in 1982, I believe. a follow-up paper in 1983 because so many people disagreed with it. It's one of the more controversial articles in terms of the amount of people talking about it, but nobody could agree on why it's wrong. So there must be 5 or 6 different ways that people disagree with the knowledge argument, and there's a lot of disagreement about where it goes wrong. But none of those people could agree amongst each other. People who disagree with the conclusion. So definitely, it's not that this argument is thought to be a completely successful argument. Perhaps in a way, unlike RYLE'S category mistake argument, which is thought generally to be, I think, a successful argument against dualism. So this argument in favor of dualism is not thought to be a lay-down argument for dualism. There are lots of responses you could make, but none of them are agreed upon as the right response. So the debate continues on that. So still you will see people debating, philosophers debating, at least philosophers, about whether this argument works and more particularly why it doesn't work. So that's a thought experiment, maybe one of the more well-known thought experiments. It's worth being cautious, and one of the lessons, one of the things people have said about this, the Mary the neuroscientist argument, is to be aware that thought experiments have limitations. So, for example, the thought experiment that I did earlier about the so-called Gettier case against the idea that knowledge is a justified true belief, that is in a way unproblematic. I'm asking you to imagine that the clock is broken. And that's a fairly simple thing for me to ask you to imagine. So whatever follows from that, we can take it as revealing something. But when I ask you to imagine a neuroscientist who knows everything there is about the brain and how it works, then what exactly am I asking you to imagine, and can you really do that? Is an interesting question. And some people have thought that it's not really possible for you to imagine that. You can imagine somebody saying that they know everything. You can imagine someone being regarded as knowing everything, but can you really imagine someone knowing everything? So thought experiments have limitations, are thought to have limitations. Nevertheless, they're a key part of the way philosophers do things. Okay, here's just a problem that I thought I have to add in, and it's a little bit out of nowhere. But before we get on to more hard and harder problems of consciousness, I wanted to just describe this problem because it's related to various other problems, and it's rather a serious one. And it's called the problem of mental causation. And the problem is really that these 3 statements aren't compatible. And no one can really figure out which one to throw away, or rather, they don't want to throw away any, maybe except for the 3rd one. Okay, so here's the idea. The idea is physics is causally closed. But what that means is that in order to, in some way, in order to account for another way. In order to account for what happens at the level of physics, you don't need to talk about the economics, for example. In that sense, physics is kind of separate from economics, right? It doesn't have, you don't need to talk about, well, you know, these molecules were moving this way over here, but then interest rates went up, and so therefore, that kind of chain of causal reasoning doesn't happen in physics. And the idea is that physics is just closed in terms of closed off causally. It's its own kind of autonomous, I suppose you would say. In order to describe everything in physics, you only need physical forces. So take that as given. The second one is that consciousness has causal effects. So when you're conscious of something, that can cause something, or you feel pain, and so you move your arm away from fire, let's say. So you're being conscious of the pain caused that. Is something that we will usually agree to, right? The third one is a little bit trickier to explain, but it's the idea that so non-reductive physicalism is the idea that that we gain something by keeping mental vocabulary that we couldn't, even in principle, we couldn't do without talking about minds and consciousness and things above the physical. That there's a position in philosophy that really, in some sense, being conscious is just being in a certain kind of brain state, let's say, or even just physical state. And there are others who think that mental vocabulary is, or mental concepts are, and that they describe a part of the way the world is that would be left out if you were to just reduce everything and talk about how the what the molecules are doing. That there is something genuinely new that gets added. New maybe not in terms of extra non-physical things, but extra properties of things that get added in when you make it somehow necessary, or at least non-redundant, to use mental vocabulary to talk about people seeing things and believing things and being conscious of things. That this actually adds something. That consciousness itself, as such, has some effect. That's, broadly speaking, well, in fact, I've just pointed out the incompatibility, I suppose. So non-reductive physicalism is a popular idea like that we can't reduce mental vocabulary, mental terms, mental concepts down to just physical, molecular terms. And so that idea doesn't sit very comfortably, or perhaps it even is just incompatible with the first two. That physics is its own, at the level of physics, things are sufficient to cause everything at the level of physics, let's say. So this is known as the problem of mental causation, and I'm not trying to give a solution to it. I just wanted to point out that this is known to be a problem, and it's a problem for within consciousness as well, because one of the things you get from the knowledge arguments, Mary the neuroscientist, who knows everything at a physical level, right? She knows exactly how the molecules are acting and all that sort of thing, and therefore she knows what's going to happen next, if you like. Based on just her knowledge of the brain, she's going to know what someone's going to say, right? So she will know that a person looking at a red thing for the first time is going to say, whoa, what an amazing experience, I never had that before. She's going to know that much, right? So that means, so in other words, at the level of, at a certain level, she has enough knowledge to describe everything that's going to happen physically, right? But so if the argument, if the conclusion of the argument is right, that nevertheless there is something non-physical that she learns about, then that thing, whatever it is, can't be having any causal effects. Because if there had no causal effects, she would have somehow known about it, right? So here we have the problem in that sense of mental causation. So if the conclusion of the knowledge argument is right, then this phenomenal quality of what it's like to see is causally inert, as I say, and that's a problem. Okay, anyway, so more generally, there is the problem of mental causation. Okay, so finally, we get to the hard problem. Probably, or now I'm not so sure. You might have heard of the hard problem of consciousness. This is made famous by Dave Chalmers in his 1996 book. In fact, it was reading this book that propelled me on the research that I did for my PhD thesis. In some way in the opposite direction, I wanted to argue that the hard problem isn't so hard, or at least isn't hard in the way that Dave Chalmers argued. But it's an important distinction to understand. So, in some way, and I'm going to suggest this, am I going to suggest this here? Yes, you could think of the hard problem as being the philosophical problem, where we're not even confident that the terms we're asking in are the right terms. And we have a sense that we're maybe confusing ourselves with concepts. But at any rate, by the easy problem, what Dave Chalmers meant, and he certainly didn't mean this to be insulting to people who are working on it, because he knows that they're very hard problems. This is the problem basically of how the brain works, and what causes behavior, what causes us to do the things we do, how consciousness functions, as he would have said it. So those things even if we don't know how to solve them now, we kind of know that we'll find solutions. There's a kind of incrementally we'll get there. We have some sort of confidence in that. The hard problem is something that we don't have any confidence about, even that. So the hard problem is the problem of why, when I look at a red thing, I have this particular sensation. Why that sensation and not some other kind of sensation? Why is it reddish and not greenish? Why this and not that sensation? Or why no sensation? Could there not be creatures out there that are exactly like me, but who don't have any sensations at all? They act as though they have sensations, but just they don't. There's just nothing happening. So, and if that can't be, then why not? And that's known as the hard problem. In some way, I think that it's maybe better to describe this as the philosophical problem, in the sense that we're not really confident that we know how to think about the problem. But that's, in a way, my take on it. Recently, and I understand yesterday there was talk about the meta hard problem. Did someone here give that talk? This is a recent talk by a recent paper by Dave Chalmers, kind of extending this. So the meta problem, or meta hard problem? Hard meta problem. the meta problem. So this is the problem of why we even are tempted to think that there is a hard problem. Even if you think, basically his idea is, even if you think that there's no hard problem, that it's not in the end problematic that that we will in some, if you think that there someday we'll be able to figure out why we have a red sensation, particular sensation that we have when we look at a red thing, even if you think that somehow we'll be able to figure that out eventually, still, it has a different character than other problems. So it seems trickier somehow to know, to try to figure out why, let's say, why there can't be so-called philosophical zombies. And so a philosophical zombie is a thought experiment. So the idea is that, or I guess I just described the thought experiment. We imagine somebody who has, who is physically exactly like you are, but is totally without any phenomenal consciousness. And if that seems possible, why does it seem possible? In a way, even if it's in the end not possible, there is still a problem of why it seems possible. And that's in a way the meta problem that David Chalmers is now talking about, or has written about. So the meta, I was going to say something else more there. The meta problem, I lost my train of thought on that one. If I think about it again, I will.
Is it kind of psychological one? Because we are tempted to. So
yeah.
This
right. In a way, you can think of it. I think you can think of it as. But it's more like. Yeah, so why do we think there's a problem? If you're asking why do we think anything, then that's kind of psychological question, right? But the question, why is it more problematic? It might not be a psychological, that answer might not be psychological. Why is it harder to figure out? Why does it seem possible? It might be not exactly just a psychological question, but it's definitely in that realm of why do we, yeah, you could say, and if we were to figure that one out, maybe that would be an advance. So why do we think that there could be somebody who's physically like me, but totally without any phenomenal conscious properties, without any consciousness? Why do we even think that? If we knew that answer to that, then that would be, I think, a solution to the meta problem. And maybe even by extension a solution to the hard problem, but I don't know if that Dave Chalmers thinks of these as connected in that way. The meta problem is that why consciousness is different. In a way, it's the as you probably know, consciousness studies is very new, and this meeting is part of a new movement, let's say, to study consciousness, and it was regarded as not kind of not legitimate in a way for decades. And so the meta problem could be thought of as, what is that? What's different about consciousness that we think of it in this kind of way? So what's different about consciousness as opposed to all the other properties that we use? There's no problem about beliefs and desires, and all these mental terms have this relatively unproblematic features. We kind of feel like we can study them. Consciousness itself has a different character somehow. It seems harder, more harder to get a grip on, harder to talk about, harder to know how to approach. That, in a way, the fact of that is a problem. That's the meta problem, as I understand it. So, oh yes, I forgot actually how to define easy and hard problem. So this is, in a way, just the way I think Dave Chalmers defines it. Understanding the neural causes of behavior would be the easy version, and hard understanding why state has any particular meaning. any particular brain state as any particular phenomenology. So I already said this. Hopefully you got it. So I just wanted to make an analogy at this point, actually. One thing that philosophers do often do is have a rather broad background. So as a philosopher of mind, you might also be doing something like philosophy of language or ethics or some other rather broad area of philosophy. And that can be useful because sometimes you notice similarities which you wonder if they're useful or not. So here's one kind of other gap that I'll just describe it a bit. Now I'm going to kind of leave it there. So here is David Hume, actually. It's a long quote, but I'll explain a bit first. So there's consciousness is not the only thing that we wonder if it's how to think about it. There are other aspects of human life that we also wonder a lot about, whether we've really got this the wrong way around somehow. And ethics is one of these. And meta-ethics is the study of what is it to be ethically right, ethically wrong, good, bad, these kind of terms. What's the, what are they? Do they exist really? And this problem is not solved and is made particularly famous by David Hume, 18th century philosopher, who raised it in this context. I'll read it out but soon, but the idea is that it seems that we can have a complete description of the way the world is, and that description wouldn't tell us anything about the way the world should be, you know, how we should act, how we should behave, what's the right thing to do. It seems that we don't get that from this kind of description of how the world is. So let me just read Hume for you, and I'll talk about it a bit more. So this is Hume in 1738 saying this. So in every system of morality, the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that's not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but it is, however, of the last consequence. Whereas this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it is necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from the others which are entirely different from it. The distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on the relations of objects, nor is it perceived by reason. So, in a sense, Hume is talking about a kind of explanatory gap. What explains whether something is right or wrong? It seems like no description of the world can do that, because no description of something is the case can get you to what ought to be the case. Anyway, this is Hume's raising of the problem of the whole idea, in a sense, of right and wrong, is and ought, and where we get that from. We can even understand it as there being a kind of easy and hard, maybe even meta problem. So we can easily understand consequences of our actions. Well, I say easily. we know how to understand the consequences of our actions. We can. It's not particularly problematic to try to think about what's going to happen if I do this and this and this and this. We can figure that out. Or it might be difficult. maybe sometimes in principle impossible, in practice impossible, but in principle we know how to do it. So, oops, sorry if I'm typing there. The hard problem for Hume is understanding why we ought to bring about any particular one of those consequences, why any of them are good or bad or whatever. So this seems, for Hume, there's a kind of just an unbridgeable gap between how things are and how they ought to be. And I say the asterisk hard is supposed to be meta. So there is a kind of meta problem there to be solved as well, which is to understand why we're inclined to think of some experiences good and bad, good and others, some consequences as good, others as bad at all. Why are we even inclined to think in that way? So that's a kind of meta problem. So, and I'm bringing this up purely just to give a kind of analogy, which philosophers do sometimes do, to totally different fields, different areas of philosophy, just to try to think through it, if the solution of a problem in another area might help. But I wanted to just give you a flavor of that this is not the only part of philosophy where these kind of gaps exist. Okay, so shall we take a short break? Like 5-minute break, because I'm then going to go into the harder problem. So, shall we take a break? 5-minute break? Okay, 5-minute break, come back at, well, like in 5 minutes. And in the meantime, if you have any questions that you think of, feel free to ask me in the break or think of asking the mic over.
Not this moment, because not all.
You can do that later.
It's okay.
Is it just my
So
is it just my phone problem?
people are doing something like this.
On my side working?
Yeah, this one.
I
So,
see.
but
So is it
so what was this is from?
maybe the link provided here is
We have something different. Well, different because this is my so for smartphone. That means we have some problem.
talking to the link to
okay. I'll check the link itself if you are not it works from Wikipedia, so it could be that it doesn't work. Oh.
This is a phone call. Computer is fine.
I'll try. Hey John, can I have a one question before going to the harder problem?
Yeah.
In the earlier part, when you talked about conceptual analysis, the conceptual analysis of consciousness or conceptual analysis of water, is it kind of dictionary definition or everyday definition or something? Or because I had a similar argument by Johnson talked about to start question of consciousness. We got to start from common sense definition of consciousness, not the analytical definition of consciousness. So that's something similar to it. So I want to know more about what is exactly is conceptual analysis.
Yeah. That's a very good question. I don't know, so the idea that the analytic definition of consciousness and the common sense would be different sounds problematic to me. So what converge? What would be the same, right? I don't quite know what's going on there. But, yeah, what is it to analyze a concept? There's a, I guess, well, we need when we this is my idea. We need to do it that when we suspect that we're talking at cross purposes with somebody, and that's causing us to not agree. Let's say if you and I are disagreeing about whether I know something, then it might be that I'm using a different sense of know than you are, and one way of solving that will be to actually talk about, well, what do we mean by to know, and how you figure that out, what we mean by to know, is. So, well, one way is to go to the dictionary, but the dictionary is just somebody's idea of how to swap the words for some other words, right? It might not be a very detailed or insightful might not help much in that sense. It might be just another word that means kind of the same thing, but you might not know what that means much either. Or at least the ambiguity might be in that word too. So you might have to work harder to figure out, to separate out, if you like, what different things you could be meaning, and what we actually mean by this word. I'm not sure this is helping.
Thank you very much.
There was something else I was going to say too, now I've forgotten it. Oh, so, but Russell, I talked to you earlier about Russell and his idea that the present King of France actually means there is a King of France and Russell took that to be one of the things Russell seems to have been proud of is that he figured out the correct analysis of the word the. So the word the is a kind of something that we didn't really know before what it meant, although we use it all the time. You know, the King of France. For Russell, we use these words and we communicate them, but we don't necessarily consciously think about how much we're communicating when we use these words. So, the King of France. Well, if you say that, then you mean that there is a King of France. That's one of the things you mean. And there are these things which are just part of our shared understanding and shared use of the word, but we just might not know what that is, especially for a complicated word like consciousness. So how to do it? Well, how to analyze the word? There are lots of ways, and nowadays we have the beginnings of a movement in philosophy called experimental philosophy, XY, and their idea is that this is a kind of empirical question, actually. Conceptual analysis is a kind of linguistic study. We need to do surveys and ask and find out by probing people, testing, surveying, questionnaires, all this, what people are meaning by it. And that can often involve thought experiments. So what would you say in this case? And that's what we often ask ourselves. And that's why thought experiments are really useful. We give a thought experiment and we ask, is this a case of knowledge, do you think? And the person might respond saying, well, doesn't really seem like it to me. I don't think they know in that case. Well, then that gives us some clue about what we mean by a word like know. So that's, anyway, so that's an extended and rambling answer to your question, but I hope that it helps. Yeah, conceptual analysis is controversial. Is there any other questions that anybody had about the preceding? Yes, from a philosopher.
Yeah, use the microphone.
Hello? Yeah. I know that when Jackson proposed his various room arguments, he's defending epiphenomenalism. I'm not sure that the argument implies epiphenomenalism. That part's confused me a little bit.
Yes.
Can you explain that, please?
Yes. I agree with you that there are many people who don't think that it implies epiphenomenalism. That is, that qualia have no causal power. But certainly the argument, the paper is called, well, no, not the paper. Is it the second paper? Which is called Epiphenomenal Qualia. That's the title of the paper. So at least at that time, Jackson thought that it implied epiphenomenalism. And there are ways of getting out of that consequence, I know. That would take us into really philosophical territory that maybe it's better not to go into. I'm interested in your ideas about why it doesn't. But I totally agree with you that it's not the, many people take it that it doesn't imply epiphenomenalism. Although that's a problem, right? You have to somehow try to escape it, to escape that consequence. Anyway, that's the best I'll do now, but I'll talk to you later about it. Philosopher to philosopher. Any other questions?
Just one quick question. Yeah. What do you think is the role of intuition in
that's a great
studies? And the second question is, whose intuition?
Yeah, that is a great question. I didn't even think till now that I left that off the methodology section. Intuition is not a methodology. I don't think it's actually a methodology, but definitely. So here's one way that I think. I think there are a couple of ways that intuition is used in philosophy, and one of them is for semantic questions, where people will be asked, the clock stopped. You've just the clock stop happens to be the right time of day that you look at it. You know, and you'll say no, it doesn't. I don't think you know in that case, just lucky. And there you're using, it's a kind of, you might say semantic intuition, but if other people have a different intuition, then we suddenly can't rely on intuition anymore, right? We have to choose some kind of other way of figuring out the answer. And I think that's generally how we have to approach things. So often intuition is a starting point. You choose somewhere as a place that you can't necessarily defend, but that you think that it seems right to you, and you can't really imagine other people disagreeing. So you start there. And if someone disagrees with your starting point, you might say, oh, it was just intuitive to me. That was sort of an intuitive starting point. But you can't defend it, and you precisely cannot defend it. So if anyone disagrees, you have to find some other way of settling the question. But intuition is often used, to my mind, as a starting point, like that. And I think that's often misunderstood as, you start from a premise that you think nobody else will object to. But there are cases where somebody will object to that starting point, and object on the basis that the person is merely having intuition, and that's they have a different intuition. And it sounds like then there's a kind of argument of intuitions, or clash of intuitions, or something like that. But it's really just a clash of what's an agreed upon starting point in that case, I think. And there's no shared intuition, then that's not a good starting point. That's one case. Another case, the semantic case is a little bit different, I think. If I ask you what you look at the clock, it's stopped, but it stopped at exactly the right time. So do you know the time looking at that clock? And you say, sure, you know. And I say, and someone else says, no, you don't know that. In that case, in this case, the person who has a different intuition maybe is going to be confused by what you mean, and it'll be because they, in a sense, meant a different thing by that word than you did. And in that case, it's in some way more serious because we're using words in different ways. We didn't realize it, and in that case, intuitions are, in some ways, we use words with some kind of expectation that other people understand the same thing that we do by them. And words have meanings that we rely on, and relying on those meanings, and your understanding of the language in a way is just you're using intuition. And if other people mean different things by the words they say, well, that's a serious kind of miscommunication issue, which of course again we have to settle, but it wouldn't be settled in automatically in a particular person's favor. It would have to be some other way of just finding out where people are getting their intuitions from in that case, and then going from there. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think behind this question that there's this worry that lots of discussions in philosophy is based on intuition that's probably only shared by philosophers.
That's only shared by philosophers. Yeah. That's cruel but kind. I think, yeah. I think in that case, of course, the intuition isn't reliable and shouldn't be relied on in those cases. But there's more to say, I think, and it is that philosophers are do sometimes use words in a technical sense, like phenomenology or qualia or something like this. And I think that they're not always aware, in a way that becomes part of their ordinary vocabulary, and they feel like they have intuitions about its use, but these words are actually technical and no one else has any intuitions about them. And that can happen just because you become part of a, I don't know, put it another way. What I was saying earlier about intuition being just of an assumed shared starting point, let's say. It might be that among philosophers that there do arise these assumed shared starting points, but they only arise among philosophers because of various discussions that they've been having. And in the case where they're not shared by others, that is a kind of serious problem, I think. You get, particularly I think in philosophy, you get a lot of, I don't know, non-physicalistic kind of intuitions that are problematic, we think. But, yes, I don't know. I totally take your point, and I think it probably does happen. But I think that one thing that I want to encourage is that when you do have it, you don't share the intuition, that you should not think twice about saying it. It is an argument that you don't share that intuition. Then you have the person you're talking to has to find some other way of settling the question. And certainly, philosophers' intuitions are not particularly to be privileged. So I think that if it seems that that's how the discussion is going, that the philosophy intuition, because they're philosophers, they have special intuitions. That's definitely not the case, and I think that if it looks like that's being assumed to be the case, then it's wrong, and you should feel free to disagree on the basis that you don't share the intuition. Does that help? Are there any more questions? That was really Yeah, I didn't talk about intuitions, and it comes up a lot in philosophy. In fact, there are whole books about intuition, which one could get into now. Are there any other questions before I push on with the harder question? I think you might have to get up, Hashkin, and or is the there it is, sorry. Yes.
Could you explain more about your thoughts on the relationship between scientific investigation and conceptual analysis?
Oh, scientific. You mean the Jack Smart, the water case that I went to earlier?
As an example.
Could I explain my source?
Yeah, thoughts.
My thoughts, my own thoughts. Actually, I'm about to do that, in a way. So, in my explanation of a harder problem, I'm going to come back to that. So that is a fantastic segue. Thanks very much. So, yeah, let me just do that. That'll allow me to get on with this too. It's going to come up. Not exactly in that form, but in a related form that hopefully will make it clearer. Okay, so let me explain the harder problem of consciousness. And I do think that this is so named by Ned Block, and it's, I do think that it's more, it's a harder problem. And here it is. Okay, so the idea, the thing that we want out of a theory of consciousness is a theory that is not chauvinistic, that it doesn't apply just in the human case. Somehow, at least, we, as a starting point, imagine that consciousness is something that other kinds of beings could have, that we could create artificial consciousness, and that doesn't have to have a brain. And in order for, so in order to think that, we've got to think beyond the brain, if you like, that there's consciousness. We've got to think of a fully general theory of what is consciousness. And so in order to do that, what we need is we need to collect all the samples. We're representative, if you like. We need to know first, so what in the universe is conscious, so that we can figure out what's the thing that they have in common. And that will presumably give us a general theory. Or at least that will be a starting point, right? But in our case, in the case of consciousness, we only have ourselves that we know are conscious. And we know that by introspection. So we know that we're conscious because we feel the consciousness, if you like. So we know we're conscious. We can guess there are other things that are kind of like us are conscious. So, animals which are sort of more like us, we're more likely to think that they're conscious. And that seems to be based on just closeness to us. But that's all. And but that as a way of picking out what's conscious, just similarity to us, seems like a really biased kind of way of picking out what's conscious in the world. So we don't have we can't really be confident in that method of picking out what's conscious. And that means we don't have a way of even starting to be able to gather the materials to have a general theory of consciousness. So this is the harder problem, Ned Block's harder problem. So that's the whole argument. I'm just going to go through it more step by step. So and here we get to the water case. So if I want to know what something is, we need a kind of a rule of thumb for picking it out in the first place. So let's say water. You need so I put it there, you need a kind of working definition. What's the phenomenon that you want to find out about? And, if I got right. So you want to study water, you need to know, at least in a rough and ready rule of thumb, working definition kind of way. So what is the water? So that I can get it and study it. We know in the case of water, it's, we can say, the top one, top two are water, the other two are not. We know that just by our use of the word. We just know what water is. That's a kind of purely knowing how to use the word water. We know that the top two are water, the other one are not. We have a way of picking it out. This slide is a lot more visual. Okay, so in the case of consciousness, we've only got one way of picking it out for sure, and that's your own case. You're conscious. That's the only one that you know for sure is. Right. And this comes partly from the idea that, well, what's consciousness? It's something that it's a state that it feels like to be in. It's the state that when we're thinking of Mary seeing redness for the first time, she has a red experience. Well, that's what it is. Having that kind of thing. It's got to feel like something. It's got to feel like something from the inside, let's say. And if it doesn't, then you're not conscious. So in that sense, we have a way of picking it out, a very clear way of picking it out, but that only applies to us. And one individual is not really enough. Okay, so the other way of picking out is chauvinistic, the next premise. So this is actually an old problem. It's called the problem of other minds. How do we know that anything else has a mind? And one statement of this problem comes from 150 years ago. John Stuart Mill wrote this kind of commonsensical answer to the problem of other minds. How do you know other human beings have minds? Well, he said, I conclude other human beings have feelings like me because first, they have bodies like me, which I know in my own case is the antecedent condition of feelings. And because, secondly, they exhibit the acts and other outward signs which, in my own case, I know by experience to be caused by feelings. So, it's a kind of, by outward similarity, we guess a kind of inward similarity. That's the idea. But that doesn't allow you to rationally conclude that in the case of something which is radically not like you, you can't really make any conclusions about how it feels to be them. This is, of course, the problem of Nagel's problem of the bat, if you know that one. So because let's say we're only entitled to think of things conscious that are like us, because that's how we know consciousness. We just guess from a number of similarities, let's say. Outward similarities imply some kind of general similarities, which implies similarity of consciousness, because it's just, part of the general similarity. But something which is not like you in various ways, well, maybe they lack consciousness. So there's no rational way to conclude anything not like you physically is or isn't conscious. Okay, the next premise, therefore, we have no confidence that we have a way of just picking out instances of consciousness in the general case. So neither method So method meaning neither inward observation, neither introspection, nor by just general similarity, give us a way of ruling in or out creatures that are not similar. So Ned Block has, in his paper, he talks about the case of Commander Data from the Star Trek series, The Next Generation. It's from the 80s. I don't know if you've seen it. But at any rate, the thing about Commander Data in this series is that he's a character who is a robot, android, but his brain is, or rather, what's in his head is complicated. No one can figure out how it works, but it's very different from a brain. So he's one of a kind because he was built, and then that person died and lost the plans, or something like that. And no one can figure out how it works. They only know that it doesn't work like a brain works. But otherwise, he's just like us. So, so Block says in this case, because it's so different inside, we can't use our ordinary way of telling whether, of inferring from general similarity to similarity of consciousness as well. Because it might be one of the things, we know that there's dissimilarity in terms of brain structure, so maybe consciousness is another way that's also dissimilar. How could we make that judgment? We simply cannot, is Block's argument. And because we can't, because we don't know whether Commander Data in this is conscious or not, we don't know that fact, we can't use what we know about the structure of the brain, or Data's brain, we can't fold that into our general theory of consciousness, so that we can't fold it in, we can't, let's say, include that data as part of the things which are conscious to come up with a general theory, but we also can't exclude it either. And therefore we can't begin to make a general theory of consciousness. Any theory of consciousness has to be just a theory of what causes behavior. That's another conclusion that I particularly myself want to make. Forget about that one. So this is a quote from this article called The Harder Problem of Consciousness. And I'll probably end here, I think. So Block says, the root of this epistemic problem, this problem of knowing what's conscious, is that the example of a conscious creature on which the science of consciousness is inevitably based is us. But how can science based on us generalize to creatures that don't share our physical properties? It would seem that a form of physicalism that could embrace other creatures would have to be based on them, at least in part in the first place. But that cannot be done unless we already know whether they're conscious. So that's the problem for a general theory which is not just about us, not just human consciousness, let's say, but consciousness in general. I think, right, we'll stop with the Turing test. So maybe we're just about at time, I think. Does anybody have any, is that right, Masatoshi? 2 hours, right?
No, no, you can extend if you have something more.
Oh, well, not particularly. I mean, there's Turing test. Let's not go to the Turing test. No, I think the harder problem is a good place to end it. Does anybody have any questions? Keep in mind, this is a tutorial for scientists.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, so the clarification. Just to clarify, to help other people.
Yeah.
Including me. So what's exactly the problem? So I can think of two kinds of
this is working.
So one problem there is that we don't know for sure whether a particular entity, like a robot or other kind of creature, is conscious or not. So yes or no questions. We don't know for sure yes or no the entity is conscious or not. That's one question. The the other question is that even if we know for sure that that entity is conscious, we don't know for sure what kind of consciousness that entity has. So the
kind of consciousness.
Yeah. So the bat. So you talk about bats.
Yeah.
The Nagels. So I mean, I think that typically philosophers, including Nagel, assume that the bat is conscious. The bats are having some kind of conscious experience when they are reacting to the ultrasound or something.
Yeah.
So let's assume for sure that we are certain that the bats are having some kind of conscious experience. The question then is like, but we don't know. We can't imagine what kind of conscious experience they are having. So that's another problem, right? So
yeah,
because if you want to have a general theory of consciousness, then we want to look at all the cases, all the variations of consciousness,
right,
and see what's really common, what's really different.
Yeah.
But as long as we are not able to imagine what it is like to be a bat, then even if we know for sure that they're conscious, still we have the problem. So there are two different kinds of problems.
They're definitely different. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I don't know that Bloch in this article or elsewhere talks about that particular problem of kinds of consciousness. And I wonder if this is, I don't know. No, anyway, he doesn't talk about kinds of consciousness, more just a whether or not. And that's what he thinks is the thing that we particularly lack, just whether or not something is conscious. Maybe if we knew that is conscious, we could get some idea about the kind of conscious from the, what's being represented or something like that. Probably Bloch wouldn't say that, but at least it would be something. But we don't know. Yeah, we don't neither whether anything of anything, whether it's conscious or not, and we also don't know. I mean, almost follows. We also don't know what kind of consciousness it has even. Both of those things. I'll just say both of those things. Any more questions? Then.
Yeah. So in this afternoon we have a debate session. So
debate, right?
how can you relate this to the question for debate session 1? How to collaborate?
Right. Yes, I know that this debate is happening in the afternoon, right? Between whether philosophy is useful for a scientist and the other way around. I actually don't have any thoughts I want to put forward here about it. It's a really interesting question. I could just wait until the debate to talk about that. Yeah, in some ways I think of them as different problems. There are philosophical problems and then there are scientific problems. It's partly how I divided up the hard and easy problem into the scientific problem and the philosophical one. Whether that's in the end, but that implies no collaboration. So that sounds pessimistic. No, I don't want to be pessimistic with this meeting. And it must not be the end of the story, because I know that there is, in fact, a lot of fruitful collaboration between philosophers and scientists. And partly I do think that, so philosophical problems are everywhere. And philosophical problems are often confusions, fallacies, ambiguities, all of these things that philosophers spend their time dealing with, and which they think of as often the main problem to deal with. Those things are everywhere, and particularly in a field like consciousness studies where there's so much uncertainty about the terms and the concepts being used, that philosophers have got to be useful there. But yeah, maybe I should just leave it there. So the debate is starting at 1:30, and until then there's nothing? That's in 2 hours.
3 p.m.
Okay, all right. So anyway, I'll be around then for the debate as well. So feel free to come and grill me or disagree with me in the meantime. And thanks very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Yeah, actually, I saw you're starting from very, very basic part. What is the task?
Right. Good. I'm glad it's good.
Especially because I heard that there's some
Yes.
Making building new concept.
Yes. Yeah, building new concept one I didn't but I told it last week. I thought it didn't in the end. I'm John. Oh, right, yes, right. Yes.